I think I best leave it to you, Jonathan. Right now, I'm pretty beat up. I can feel,
Yeah. Can I
and
just take a moment, Ivo? Listen, I just want everyone here who's watching, and it's really great that at the end of the day we have about 40 people still. It's been a
yes,
long day, and it's been arranged with a great deal of cooperation from our audience and guests, but with a huge driving force, tenacity, and patience of Ivo Mensch, our main host. So although we can't have an auditorium give rapturous applause, while Ivo zones out for the last session, can we all mentally thank him and give him a little wave or something? Because he's made today possible. So thank you,
thank you,
Ivo. Your efforts much appreciated, and it's been a wonderful day to be part of. So I'm very grateful.
thank you.
Um, the next thing to say is that I didn't get a chance to go to the green room. I don't think any of us did, Kateryna, and Mychailo. So I haven't had a chance to meet you each in person. I'll briefly introduce you if that's okay, so that people can know who we're about to talk with, and then I'll try and frame the final discussion. So just briefly, so Kateryna Yasko, or Katya, is an organizational psychologist, a trainer for the development of emotional intelligence, trust, cooperation, effective communication, and peaceful conflict resolution, although with some caveats in the current context, and co-founder of the consulting company Integral. Mychailo, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Wynnyckyj, you can correct me in a minute how to say that, is an associate professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and Ukrainian Catholic University. He's also the author of Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity. And Kateryna Shynkaruk, I think, is a senior lecturer of international relations at the University of Kyiv, Mohyla Academy in Kyiv since 2016. She's an associated fellow of the Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University since 2021. She's an invited expert and consults leading Ukrainian think tanks on foreign and security policy issues. So I'm glad to have you all with us. And like we say, it's been a deliciously long day in a sense, and yet there's still energy, I believe, to further deepen the discussion. For my part, there's been moments of great clarity on the documenting of human rights abuses, the challenges journalists face with both sidesism. There's been the exploration of humor and the challenges of making jokes. I was really struck when Anton mentioned this. He's normally imagining supermarkets when he makes his joke, but now in the supermarkets, there are Russian soldiers. I was just very struck by what it would be like to have a psyche like that. We've had rich discussion about Bildung and related matters. And we're very much thinking about the future now. Timothy Snyder, in one of his recent talks, spoke about one of the main dividing lines between Russia and Ukraine being, broadly speaking, Russia still being very past-oriented towards the great imperial past, whereas Ukraine was much more about looking towards the future. But in the context of widespread destruction of the country, it begs the question of how does one begin to build that future? So I'm gonna, just because I'm a familiarity, I'm gonna ask Katya first. Katya, you spoke earlier today with great elegance about the cultural differences of Ukraine and Russia. And I want to begin with a little curveball, if you don't mind, because today, obviously, we're friends of Ukraine. I think the hosts, it's fair to say, and most of the audience don't see the war with any great moral ambiguity. We see it primarily as a brutal invasion, perhaps even an attempted genocide. And so there's not any doubt about that. On the other hand, when we think to the future of Ukraine, it's hard to think of the future of Ukraine without also having a future for Russia. And I know you have Russian friends, Katya, and I'm sure Mychailo and Kateryna do as well. Tell me, not just a viable future for Ukraine, but what would it look like for Russia to have a positive future? One that made them less like an imperial, dictatorial, existential threat on your doorstep, and more, again, like neighbors. What would it mean for Russia to move in that direction? What kind of credible path can we see towards that? And because it seems to me that without that, any future for Ukraine will remain perilous. So Katya, you can begin, and then I'll pass the same question on to the others as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And of course, it's a very, very complicated question. And I would like to touch upon one of the aspects, one of many. And I believe here the example of Germany may serve us because I guess that without certain shadow work, without the process of conscious repentance, there is no way for a good future for Russia. And I really do not want to speak out of some, I don't know, pride or arrogant perspective. This is really not what we need. It's more that they need it. I believe that taking responsibility at all levels, and there is a lot written about it, and there are wonderful works dedicated to comparative analysis of how different countries worked on these shadows connected to their past, and which countries were more successful and which countries were less successful. And there is a lot to learn, basically. So if there would be a will to deal with this problem, I guess that there will be ways to do that. So that's the first main step. And I guess it's not only Russian issue, it's also Belarusian issue, and some other countries who have been supporting or silently supporting Russia in this awful war and the atrocities that happened. So this is one aspect. And we already touched some others during the previous discussions, like collective Bildung. I literally do not see any other ways to bringing and population into more self-authoring stages, because it's exactly the impulsive and socialized mind that is too receptive to propaganda. Mm-hmm. And then propaganda may manipulate to any, to any direction. But in order to have this inner capacity and inner moral compass, you have to develop at least the self-authoring mind. And this doesn't develop easy. There are special approaches, and we can learn about these approaches. The Nordic countries have wonderful practices that can share with us these approaches. But how to do it in Russia without the will, I don't know, but maybe we can hope that someday there will be will to learn and accept this help.
Okay, thank you, Katya. Mychailo, I know that at some point you may have to catch a train, and so I'm keen to get you in at length before you have to leave us. What is your sense of, I mean, obviously Ukraine's future is what we're here to speak about, but to begin with a reflection on Russia's future and how it might pertain to that, what are your thoughts on the matter?
Well, let's put it this way. I have been accused, by the way, the surname, Jonathan, thank you for the introduction. Very nice of you, but the surname is pronounced Wynnyckyj, which you clearly got wrong, but that's okay. That's fine. I'll forgive you this time. Next time, being a Ukrainian, I'll have to shoot you. But that's,
with love, of course, yeah.
Of course, that's a joke, and I hope that everyone understands it as such.
Yeah.
I heard about your first. I will get to the answer of Russia. I promise. But I want to reflect on one thing before I start with the question on Russia. I had a conversation today with a very good friend of mine who's actually in The Hague at the moment, and I was listening also to your introduction and your statement about mass destruction in Ukraine. I think that on the news, watching the news in the West, it looks like Ukraine is much more destroyed than in fact it is. Now, I certainly don't want to belittle the war in any way. There are places in Ukraine that have been destroyed completely. And when we're talking about the Donbass, for example, when we're talking about places like Irpin, Bucha, etc. But at the end of the day, for example, I just finished a 4 days of teaching, of consulting and teaching working with medical universities, 2 specific medical universities. And they haven't been touched. They're looking at, I think that the concept that we were trying to get across, and I think that this is very important, is the Chinese character crisis. I'm sure that many of you know that the Chinese character crisis is made up of two other characters. One is threat, the other is opportunity. In other words, every crisis is both a threat and also an opportunity. And I think that that is something that the way Ukrainians are very often looking upon what's going on in the war at the moment is that this is very much an opportunity for growth. And obviously, when we talk about this war, it is a war that is happening in the context, I would analyze it as being in the context of a longer revolutionary process, which began in 2013, which obviously was a threat to the Russian regime, and the Russian regime reacted. In fact, we've seen these types of things before. I mean, remember the last revolutions that you all taught or that you all learned about in schools, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, they were all, revolutions happen together with wars. This is an unfortunate fact. And we are in if you like, a war of independence, which is part of very much a revolutionary process. Now, the problem is that the metropole, if you like, in other words, the imperial metropole that we are trying to get ourselves away from and have been for the last, I would say, well, at least 8 years, if not 30 or 300, depending on which interpretation of history you like. That imperial metropole is the last empire, or the last, if you like, traditional type of empire, meaning territorial empire, because some would argue that the United States is an empire as well, but it's certainly an economic empire rather than a territorial one. Whereas Russia is a territorial empire, which is very much past focused, and therefore is, unfortunately or otherwise, doomed. And there is no other way of talking about it. That Russia, the Russian Federation as such, is probably not going to survive this political conflict as a single political entity. Now, that may sound like something that is very optimistic from a Ukrainian, and most Ukrainians that I know, when we talk about this, we say, yeah, we cheer that on. But from a global perspective, that's also something that is very scary, because when Russia disintegrates, it will disintegrate into 15 or 17 or 18, and I think Kateryna Shynkaruk, who is my colleague, will probably be able to say a few more words about where, whether it's 15 or 20, but the point is that the disintegration of the Federation will end up with multiple nuclear-powered, unpredictable states. And that is something that is geopolitically scary for a lot of us. At the same time, having said that, the future of Ukraine for the next 10 years, maybe 15, maybe 20, we don't know how long, is a future that is actually very similar to that of Israel. In other words, a country that is surrounded by enemies, that is receiving a large amount of support from its Western friends, at the same time is under a permanent existential threat. And until such time as that permanent existential threat from Russia is neutralized, unfortunately, we're looking at not the most optimistic of scenarios, either for the world or for Russia. Now, if you'd like, I can certainly say more, but I think that Katya certainly has a lot more to say on this topic than I do.
Thank you very much, Mychailo. That's a very good introduction. So, Kateryna, how would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for colleagues Katya and Mychailo for starting this absolutely massive, large-scale discussion about what could happen to Russia and how to minimize its threat. Well, on 24th of February, Russia has basically committed strategic suicide, I would say. And but this was not when Russia has taken this, I would say, the path of self-destruction. And here I should underline that similarly as Katya has been saying, this is not a position of arrogance or rejoice about this self-destruction that we are observing, but this is actually a threatening and intimidating neighbor we are dealing with, which we would be willing to help avoid this self-destructive path. But I'm afraid it has taken it at least as long ago as in 1917, if not earlier. And so here we are talking about the patterns, long-term patterns of destructing oneself and destructing others around. How do you stop these patterns? How do you help overcome them? This is a very large-scale question, especially when you're dealing not with a patient, but with a 140 million nation. And it is not just Putin. And I imagine you have already discussed this earlier today, that this is not Putin's war. And this makes the task much more complicated. This is not about regime change. This is about change on the social, political, cultural level, which is absolutely hard to engineer if we are talking in terms of social engineering, but also hard to predict how and when, hows and whens, and the recipe for it. I would use a metaphor of therapy, which I like a lot, applying to the States, because here you have a destructive pattern. You have, first of all, to have the patient recognize their diagnosis and take ownership of their diagnosis. And only then there could be any assistance with basically cure. There is also, I think, a lot of misconceptions about what this cure could look like. I should say that obviously this is not about showing support, showing understanding. This is how you basically would imagine the pacifist approach could look like. And again, based from the programs, today's programs and agenda, I imagine you have already discussed many of the aspects related to it. So here I would say, if Russia, by some miracle, if Russian people by some miracle would agree to take ownership of their diagnosis and accept external help in improving their situation, this would require what they call in psychotherapy tough love, right? Very, very tough approach, and boundaries and limits. And as one of the speakers today, I think Valery Pekar, he likes this idea of denazification, denuclearization. So all this type of approaches that qualify fit into the box of tough love. But this all is conditional to the possibility of Russia accepting that they need to take ownership and basically be agents in the process of changing some kind of new thinking, as Mikhail Gorbachev has recently reminded everybody, which does not look likely. What looks likely is actually what Mychailo had mentioned. It is external, without Russian participation or goodwill, external pressure, external isolation, and all the implications, geopolitical and social and economical, that it will lead to. Again, I would just close up this round of remarks with saying this is the path of self-destruction, and we are currently watching it progressing.
Gosh, okay, thank you. There's a lot there. And while I see the comic potential and the idea of Russia going to therapy, in terms of, you can imagine how the Ukrainian meme force, which is probably the best meme force in the world, could really go to town on this idea of Russia in therapy. But I also hear what you're saying. It's a dark prognosis. The more probable outcome is a continuation down a destructive path. The aim of this event is to think more about Ukraine's future. So I don't want to dwell on this, only to pause in terms of saying, am I hearing you right that you think the best case scenario or most probable case is not the complete transformation of Russia's heart and soul and culture, maybe with some kind of optimal new constitution giving autonomous power to 18 odd regions and some democratic revitalization, best case scenario, switching to renewable energy while they're at it? Much more likely, from what you're saying, is somehow there's a new, some kind of settlement as a result of the war. Ukraine hopefully reclaims the bulk of its territory that it's lost recently. And then somehow a new Berlin Wall, but except it's a wall somewhere very different. And Ukraine tries to go about its Western life or European life while Russia flounders. Okay, so tell me how are we seeing this vis-a-vis, I'm trying to get it, because the problem with the discussion thus far, not problem, but maybe missing point, is we're huge friends of Ukraine. We love to speak of how amazing all Ukrainians are, and we believe every word of it. On the other hand, when we're thinking about the future, to keep it real, I just want to be aware of this looming shadow and what's happening there. Is there a wall there? Is it porous? Are they changing? Are they still attacking? Talk me through how that looks. Mychailo, you want to go next?
Yeah, I did want to respond to that, because unfortunately in about 15 minutes I'm going to have to leave the meeting. I apologize, and I think it's a very good question, Jonathan. Thank you for that. There's a lot of discussion internally within Ukraine as to how we are going to defend ourselves in this, how we're going to create the, if you like, the forepost of European civilization against what looks to be a very a geographic area of chaos that's to the east, which is effectively what's probably going to happen. And that, what I envision, in fact, is a sort of an area of chaos and lawlessness at the end of the day. To use a spiral dynamic term, an area that is very red against an area that is sort of blue-orange, right? And moving towards some sort of a new types of colors. I apologize if I'm using shorthand that's incorrect, but I think that's kind of the ideas that we're getting across. Ukraine is, there's a misnomer about the fact that the word Ukraine comes from frontier land or borderland. That in fact is incorrect, but historically it's not the way it was, because the word Ukraine, Ukraina, just simply comes from Krayina, which means country, right? Which is a logical way of calling your country. You would call it a country. But it has been interpreted by historians very often as being a frontier land or a borderland. Timothy Snyder actually is very good at that, and he calls it the borderlands and the bloodlands, the borderlands. But that in fact is a frontier, is probably being a frontier for the next foreseeable several generations is probably our future. And it is a frontier, which is, by the way, not a bad future. The idea of frontier is an idea of a land of innovation, land of change, a land where, or a place where people come to self-actualize, if you like, or self-realize themselves. It's not a particularly, it's not a place for the faint-hearted, and I think that is true of Ukraine's future. But when we look at sort of historical parallels, frontier lands are always the places that, or not always, but have been very often places that have been places of innovation and places of unexpected growth and unexpected creativity. And I think that that's really the optimistic vision that I would like to see for Ukraine. It's unfortunately probably not going to be a country of 40 million. That is something that we need to understand. It's going to be a smaller country in terms of population because frontier lands are always smaller. We have had, at the moment, approximately 5.5 to 6 million people leave the country. And we have data now that shows that, for example, in polling refugees in Poland, approximately 17% have already said that they're not coming back. So we're going to have a brain drain. We're going to have a population drain. We're going to have a demographic crisis. But that means that we're going to become a country that is a frontier. And I will remind you that, you know, the history, the very optimistic parallel that I like to use for this one is the United States was a frontier as well. And 100 years later, after it stopped being a frontier, it became one of the centers of, whether we like it or not, certainly as Scandinavians, very often they'll criticize the individualism of the United States, but nevertheless, it certainly was an engine of cultural progress, of civilizational progress, and certainly one of the areas throughout the 20th century, I would say, where a great deal of good things happened for humanity, let's put it that way. And my vision of Ukraine is actually something very similar. A country that is going through a revolution, a country that's going through a war of independence, and a country that's going to be faced with not necessarily, in fact, an aggressive neighbor, because that neighbor is going to have so many problems in the future that it's probably going to be more of a Wild West kind of open land, open space that we will have to both defend ourselves against and also will be able to expand into, not necessarily territorially, but certainly in terms of ways of thinking, if you like, cultural artifacts, those types of things.
Okay. And just, I know I want to get to Katya and Kateryna, but I think this might be your last comment, Mychailo. I'll ask you one more question on the back of that. You see that as coming, as a possibility. Ukraine is a frontier. The Russian problem is not resolved, but it's attenuated by the fact that they have enough of their own problems that they're not bothering Ukraine directly. And Ukraine goes through this period of the charged reconstruction, possibly a smaller country, not all of the diaspora returns and so forth. And so would you say you're optimistic? Is that the right term? I mean, would you say that the probability is of a relatively bright future? Or would you merely say it's a possibility?
I'm obviously very optimistic, and I don't think it's just a possibility. I think we're on the right track. I think that, look, the final point that I will make is, again, a bit of a historical analogy. It would be strange if I didn't make this analogy because of my sociological background and the fact that this is sort of the basis of my book. So, look, in the past, when we've had revolutions and wars, very often these revolutions of wars have been on the cusp of large civilizational changes. So when we look at, for example, the American and the French Revolution, these were the events that very often sort of started and signified the switch from feudal agrarian to industrial society, which also meant a rejection of the divine right of kings, the creation of nation states, all of these things that we take for granted today were really started with a war of independence and two revolutions. And by the way, the War of Independence was quite bloody. And it was against a very, very, very powerful neighbor that most people considered to be obviously the hegemon at the time, certainly regionally, the British Empire. The parallels are obvious, except, or in addition to the fact that we are obviously also at a state where we're moving away from industrial society and moving towards a post-industrial society. And if we look at the social structures that have led to the local victories of Ukrainian forces, for example, they are about hierarchy, they're about network structures, they're not about hierarchy, they're not about bureaucracy, they're not about rules, they're about, if you like, again, going back to the concept of spiral dynamics, they're very green, they're very about sort of consensual kind of things. And so, to the extent that we can talk about the inevitability of progress, we are at the cusp of that progress. So even if there's going to be a sort of a local, there will be local losses and there will be local defeats, history is on our side. And if history is on our side, then obviously I'm very optimistic about the results. Again, where the line of the frontier is drawn, that is another question. How many people will be living on that frontier? That is another question. But certainly, I am of the opinion that a generation forward, we're going to be looking at Ukraine as being a place of new senses, new ideas, certainly new structures that others will be looking towards as personally being a place of opportunity, and also a place from which the rest of, if you like, Europe at least, and the Western world will have something to learn from.
Okay, thank you, Mychailo. You're free to do.
I apologize that I have to. I apologize that I have to run. I have a train to catch. My apologies to all of you that are here. Thank you for giving me your attention, and I apologize if I was monopolizing it.
Thanks for joining us. It's been a great pleasure hearing from you. And everyone, the link to your book is in the chat, so hopefully we'll follow you that way too. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the train ride. Okay, so I think Katya, I want to ask you next. Vis-a-vis the analysis of spiral dynamics there, because it speaks to your earlier talk. What does it mean for Ukraine to develop in developmental terms now? I mean, are you already there? Like, what are the blind spots? What are the aspects of what are the kind of healings, growth? What are the ways in which Ukrainian society now grows, recovers on different horizons? Obviously, you've got the triage of the immediate war and survival, and then you have a kind of transition to a functional rebuilding, reconstruction, and then presumably a kind of different kind of further future, 40, 50 odd years, 2 or 3 generations. And this is all happening, of course, in the context of seismic global changes, the time between worlds analysis, in which ecological breakdown is beginning to bite in various ways. Who knows what kind of technological developments will change? In the same way the smartphone was unimaginable 30 years ago, you know, what will be the equivalent? Where will virtual reality be? I suppose I'm wanting you to freewheel a little bit about the different waves of the future for Ukraine, not just getting out of the war, rebuilding the country, recovering, and some kind of renaissance, but where is it going? Like, what's the sort of telos or entelechy for the country?
Yes, I've been thinking a lot, by the way, about these terms. Which one is better to use? Definitely, recovery is not something inspiring, at least for me. Renaissance, not sure. Then I was thinking about others, maybe down. I don't know, but I am optimistic.
You mean dawn? Sorry, dawn, as in like the beginning of the day, right? Dawn.
Yes, yes. I think that the time of Ukraine is coming, and that's my. I don't know. Maybe it's my dream, but I feel a lot of energy. I feel not just there's the explosion of trust, but also explosion of creativity and. Explosion of imagination, and of course huge trauma work has to be done so that this imagination won't be hindered, because we, of course, being focused now, majority of the population on survival, it affects consciousness, and a lot of work has to be done. And it's important that it seems that the government and the society are conscious of this problem. So it's our path and our responsibility to turn the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, into growth. And there are ways to do it, and we hope that we will be able to manage this with help of different experts and foundations, because we truly need this expertise. We have done some capacity building during this last 8 years, but it's definitely not enough. Mm-hmm. But the overall vector, besides the trauma work, which is of course just a little part that has to be done, the vector is obvious. It's modernization. It's heading towards orange, and creating conditions for the investors, the certain climate, because I imagine that no resources, no money is enough from various foundations and countries. Sure. Definitely, we need to learn to earn this money, and we need partners who will be eager to invest. And for that, a certain climate has to be created in Ukraine. And I believe it is possible. And adding on to what Mychailo said, I'm even optimistic that with some, smart social policies and population management approaches, I believe that we may invite some foreigners, some expats, if we send, if we really head towards maturity and expertise as a goal, not just adding on population, but adding on certain quality of population. And already English language has been, talked about as maybe the second language in the country. It is quite possible that it will be accepted, and I personally encourage it greatly. So who knows, maybe if we say we want to get to the self-authoring mind from Robert Keegan's terms, or Orange from Spiral Dynamics terms, within 5 or 7 years, then maybe our own practices might not be enough. Maybe we need more people who want to be Ukrainians. Because, for example, my husband, who is a Lithuanian by origin, he calls himself Ukrainian. And he believes that there are many other people in the world who, by their spirit, by their relation to what is happening in Ukraine, certain qualities that Ukrainians are manifesting, they wish to be called Ukrainians. So maybe Ukraine will be able to create conditions for people to come and rebuild the country and create something totally new. Maybe it will be the lab of, development for social of human capital and innovations at a systemic level.
You're selling it, Katya. I'm believing it. I would invest and buy into that vision. So well done. I suppose I'm keen to hear from Kateryna about this as well, but the reason I'm just ever so slightly incredulous about it is that, as I was trying to point out with the earlier question, Ukraine, of course, is part of a geopolitical context. It's not just the neighbor, it's also that, moving towards modernization to someone living in London at the moment seems like a really strange objective. Like, it feels like modernization was sort of something that has come and gone, and that now modernity is almost dying or something like that. It's a very different, from where I look at the world, seems like we have problems with modernity. They're mostly ecological. To some extent, they're about technological overreach. To some extent, they're about sort of political alienation and breakdown of governance. But it's not obvious to me that modernization is the aspiration to have in the early to mid 21st century. On the other hand, I'm not Ukrainian or living in Ukraine. So tell me, Kateryna, how do you see it?
Thank you, Jonathan. I will allow myself to slightly elaborate on previous points, and then I will get back to your question about modernization, or how we can define it. Just going back to the future of Ukraine, I think that as compared to what you were asking about Russia, I think the recipes are very similar, although the resources, the human potential, the human capital, the reality we're dealing with is very different. But recipes are about, honest diagnosis, ownership, agency, and I believe these are things that are broadly recognized. What I also would like to underscore in relation to your previous question about Russia, that Ukraine's future should not be about Russia. This is like exclamation mark.
Yeah. I agree.
But this is very important in terms of, I understand that this is not what your point, sure. But I mean, this is a very important element that should be always there in all discussions, internal and external, especially internal, given the trauma that Katya had been mentioning, that it is very difficult to not talk about Russia when you are being in the hot stage of war. And it is very difficult to build a picture of the future, not putting Russia on that picture. But this is, in my opinion, very important, to have one's own picture of the future, where being against Russia, antagonist to Russia, or you name it, is not part of Ukraine's successful identity. And as you mentioned, yes, Ukraine's identity and future is in Europe. And speaking about modernization, I would not necessarily frame it in modernization terms. I think what Ukraine is going through now is maybe really a final stage of the liberation war, the hot stage of it, the liberation from imperial past, some kind of decolonization. If we call speak about decolonization in this terminology of modernization, then it is possibly applicable. But I would not just narrow down all the complexities of what Ukraine is going through to this concept, which indeed does remind us of 20th century processes rather than 21st. And here we could speak about post-modernization, digitalization. Me currently being outside of Ukraine, I can say that Ukraine has been doing a fantastic job in digital services. I can acknowledge this now, especially as seeing how these things are working elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But not just about speaking, not just about modernization or decolonization, just really, I would be more open-ended about concepts of Ukraine's progress. The idea is that Ukraine is demonstrating another miracle after Euromaidan of 2014. Back then, we remember the attention that was paid to the popular protest, to this chemistry, this absolutely unique solidarity and self-sacrifice that people had been demonstrating on Euromaidan. Now we see the same, but multiplied in hundreds of thousands. And this again, not just a chance, I would not call it a chance, I would say it's a trajectory. It's a trajectory. And this is why I'm also optimistic. As Immanuel Kant said, optimism is a moral duty. So speaking about future, we have to be optimistic because we have a stake in this future. So bottom line, I am optimistic about Ukraine's future, and I guess I am not unique in that. And second is that we can conceptualize Ukraine's path forward in different terms, but what's most important is that Ukraine is finalizing and accomplishing all the tasks of nation building, state building, finalizing all its, maybe I would say, Euromaidan agenda now with very high cost. And it is a common task of not of just Ukraine, but of all its friends to help it succeed in accomplishing these goals. And another thing, maybe going forward, like with your next question, and forgive me if that is the case, but I would say that for the West, supporting Ukraine in achieving this bright future is a question of win-win or lose-lose. It's a completely similar interests, like these interests are completely coinciding here. I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to open to the audience in a second, but Katya, do you want to just maybe say anything further, or are you happy with where we've reached at the moment? You're good. Okay. So does anyone, if anyone wants to raise a hand, we can try and bring you in. I'm going to make gallery view so I can see you. Does anyone have a question for Katya or Kateryna? I have further questions, but just want to give you a chance. No one? Interesting. Okay, I guess it's been a long day. Okay, I have one more thing to ask then for now, which is something about this vision you have of people visiting like Ukraine becoming the place to go. So rather than talking about the challenge of the exiled Ukrainians, the global diaspora, not all returning, and many young people growing outside of their homeland, not really knowing it, not necessarily wanting to go back because not maybe remembering it or not identifying with it as much. And that can seem kind of slightly tragic, but the flip side, Katya, you were saying is, if the Ukrainian spirit prevails, and it looks like there's a good chance it will, and many of you believe it will, and it remains inspiring for the rest of the world, in effect, you'll become a sort of magnet for global immigration to Ukraine, such that Ukraine becomes this center of a new dawn or renaissance, not just for Ukraine, but for humanity at some level. And I'm trying to sort of give that, not just the kind of poetic sort of marketing, but a sort of sense of credibility. And I guess there it's worth just asking, is that feasible? Because it does seem to me like there are places. I mean, Snyder called this an axial event, and I think he means by that, relating to the axial age, the world turns on this point. I think literally in terms of the meaning of axis, for something to be axial, it's the point around which things turn. To call the Ukraine conflict axial is to say that depending on how it goes, the world will go one way or the other. But there's another sense in which I think Ukraine is potentially axial, that, historically we've had major centers in, Athens and Rome, and at different points, Berlin and Paris, and maybe New York and London at different stages, sort of geographic centers where somehow the world turns from that place. And I suppose I'm interested to know if Ukraine might be such a place. When we came to the Emerge gathering in 2019, that was part of the premise. And I confess at the time, I wasn't too sure what to make of it. But now I do kind of think that Ukraine has this axial quality, that somehow through its sort of heterarchical approach, through its explosion of social trust, through its extraordinary sort of digital and technological progress, through its will to survive, through its inspirational courage, that it might be this kind of luminous soft power attractor for the rest of the world. Is that the case? I mean, do you think that, is it just a pipe dream and marketing? Is this just another way of keeping morale up? Or is it quite possible this is indeed the way things are going? And either of you can respond to that.
Frankly speaking, I don't know. Because the desire to be optimistic and to believe in this beautiful, prominent future is overwhelming. So I really believe in every word that you just mentioned. And as someone who works with teenagers from time to time, I can tell you that each and every child, 14 years plus, I'm interacting with, most of them are scattered around the world. So we're meeting online. Each and every wants to return to Ukraine and build this country, rebuild or contribute to building. And they do understand that they need to use the opportunity to get education or whatever. They are at the point of acceptance, at least now, but they do want it in order to come back. Some of them are coming back literally already, making these decisions. Like I mentioned, my son, 17 years old son, he came back from US and just with firm determination to stay and rebuild the country. Concerning the other aspects and foreigners, I think that a lot of things depend now on the governmental policies, on the decisions that will be made at the top level. Because this is immigration policy. This is not something that is decided, bottom up. But I see them quite open-minded at the moment. Zelensky has a lot of friends all around the world, and he sees that many countries are helping, are literally doing their best help, and he's meeting one after another. Yesterday was the Irish leader, and Ireland is extremely friendly and helpful, by the way. So every day he has someone to thank, and I believe that as a next step after the victory would be nurturing these connections and making them work at economic level, at social level, and other levels. So I believe what we are gaining now is huge social capital, both at the collective level, like we being spread around Europe and the whole world and getting new connections. And basically, many people are falling in love with Ukraine at the moment. And at the same time, the leadership of the country, I believe, does its best to create the sustainable long-term connections. So I think all these dreams are possible to implement in case the planet, the climate supports us, and we do not have new black swans in the nearest future. I think Ukraine has a lot of chances to succeed.
Okay, thank you. And Kateryna, you can say whatever you want, but just as Katya was mentioning black swans, there are some early signs of China showing renewed interest in Taiwan again. There are many permutations of things that can happen in the near future. You're going into evening mode there, Kateryna, I see. But yeah, you're welcome.
I apologize for that. I have a situation of a Cinderella. I have to switch on the light at certain timing.
That's
so
great.
If you give me a few minutes to switch on the lights, maybe I could get back to you in a minute. Would that be possible? As
you wish. If that's most comfortable for you, no problem. You can do that. Yeah. But equally, you're welcome to speak. It's kind of charming. It's kind of charming in its own way. If you want to speak like this, it's also all right.
Okay, well, let me do that then. Next time I will continue now. So yeah, that's very interesting. Basically, I would say that Ukraine has a chance to use to the best all its strongest characteristics that we have now discussed. But there are also challenges associated exactly with the same characteristics. And we have seen this through Ukraine's history, the independent Ukraine's history. So yes, of course, this bright future that we are all optimistic about has many challenges, internal and external. But I would like to underscore, before we go talking about China and other external challenges, I would like to underscore also that what solidifies my optimism is also the processes I observe on the ground with a very vibrant, active civil society, which becomes even more broader and more intensively engaged in the processes which I would label as state and nation building. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you have already discussed today the Lugano Declaration. Probably you did. No. The civil society had came up with a broad declaration, and it also is quite resonating in terms of putting Ukraine in the center of international developments, because even the game of words, Luhanska Declaration, which means Lugano, but also means Luhansk, which put basically Ukraine's occupied for the moment Luhansk in the center of Switzerland, by some irony, right? So this is also quite illustrative. Mm-hmm. And in this declaration, Ukraine's civil society lists the characteristics it wants to not just to cement in Ukraine's future updated social contract, which is also, I find it fascinating that in the middle of aggression, we are discussing these things, which are absolutely important, but they are also illustrative of the situation in Ukraine's mindset, civil society. They are discussing European identity of Ukraine, democratic, inclusive, participatory political regime, market economy, open and inclusive cultural identity, basically putting human dignity in the center of Ukraine's, I would say, updated rather than new social contract. So this gives huge sources, not just for faith in Ukraine's future, but basically grounds to speak about actions already being taken in that direction. This is why my point, just to sum up this discussion on internal processes, my point would be that I would not be postponing Ukraine's recovery and investments in Ukraine's recovery until some kind of technical victory declaration. We can absolutely realistically speak about moving forward with all those investment and recovery planning, and basically already fixing certain territories, especially when it comes to governance, to the institutions, to the procedures, to some non-material processes. It is absolutely possible and should be done without, postponing, because we certainly don't know how quickly Ukraine can achieve the what I call technical victory. This being said, of course, there are external processes that you mentioned, like China, which I think is an interesting actor because Russia very much had inclination to associate itself with China and basically associate China with itself, but China very smartly distanced with Russia's aggression. And currently, the distance we are seeing is very interesting, and it is even more, I would say, it is even more Eastern, if I may put it this way, than the Turkish position. So I understand that this has nothing to do with China's respect for the rule of law or territorial integrity of Taiwan, but with regard to the dynamic in Eastern Europe and how this all Russian self-destruction can play out for China. It is not, I would not say it's a linear process. China is watching and will pick the winning side. There was and also I think quite a good comparison. Unfortunately, I can't remember right now who was the first to come up with it, but it was a comparison between Belarus and China, saying that Russia will become Chinese Belarus. Yes, so these are some comments from the darkness.
Yeah, thank you. There's some light from the darkness. Gosh, well, listen, it's been 8 hours since we began this session and 1 hour for this session, and I do want to wrap up soon. But since we have the freedom, I just want to ask you both one more question. Speaking partly for yourself, but to some extent on behalf of your countrymen as well, or country folk. I suppose it's just that we had 20 weeks of these weekly sessions with either people in Ukraine or people in exile or former diaspora, and then quite a lot of Western people or just international people who have an interest in Ukraine for one reason or the other. And I'm struck week in, week out by the almost certainty that you're going to win, technically or otherwise, the emphasis on reconstruction, recovery, renaissance, new dawn, as if it's something that's inevitably going to happen. And I suppose the human in me wants to know, don't you ever despair? Like, you know, this relentless positivity and courage, is this only for the cameras? Do you have moments when we turn off tonight, do you go away and sob? I mean, there must be a sort of darker side to this. How do you find in yourself and in your communities, keeping this positivity going sounds like it must take a lot of energy. Wondering, how do you do it, really? Katya, you can go first if you like.
I want to acknowledge that I'm very touched by your question. I also want to say that there are places in my life, there are places where I cry and not only sob, but really cry and mourn. There is a place of grief. And also it's just important, it's part of emotional hygiene. It's partly conscious, partly unconscious, but you really need to connect to the sadness in order to connect also to the emotions of joy and optimism. Because your container, it's the same container, you have to be able to go up and down. Because motion, energy motion, you just need to keep an energy going in the system. So I would say that it's very important to have places where you can open your heart, let's call it like this, and belonging, community are very important for Ukrainians now. So from the very first weeks of the war, I've been trying to create some of the spaces for women who are scattered around the world like me, where we can both exchange, cry, but also listen to the Ukrainian poetry and music, and reconnect and calibrate the strings of our soul with the nation. With the soul of the nation, with the spirit of the nation. And this is done in order to keep going. So I just want to say that thanks, to science, thanks to the awareness that we have, we can use this knowledge in order to consciously manage energy, or at least try to. I don't want to boast. There's often nothing to brag about, basically, but there is a mechanism, and many people I know are using it consciously. And I imagine that there will be more. For example, one of the brightest psychologists in Germany, working with trauma, Vivian Dietmar, we will establish emotional healing space for Ukrainians starting from the fall. I know Gabor Mate, who is the best trauma expert in the world, is very supportive of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and is willing to contribute. So I believe there will be more spaces and more consciousness that we need to have space for mourning and grief in order to keep going.
Thank you, Katya. And Kateryna.
Yes, thank you for this question. And I will speak about my personal experience, but I can't help looking at it also from the political scientist perspective, in terms of looking at the challenges and opportunity, because our society is quite tough on emotional intelligence. It has patterns inherited from communist past that basically downplay vulnerabilities. And it is important to be tough. It is important to face the stress, multiple stresses of a post-Soviet person with, poker face, with a very assertive and approach that does not give much space to emotions. And basically vulnerability as an element of mature, healthy in individual and society is something that we are still learning. And I think that currently is, again, a challenge and an opportunity to learn it better, to be vulnerable, to express emotions, for strangers to hug, for an anecdotal evidence I heard about a person who was a quite high position from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, a lady, always very protocol cautious, would be given just warm hugs to Ukrainian displaced people in Poland, because this is not a time for diplomatic protocol. This is a time for being human. And so, yes, this is time to learn, also being vulnerable, and see that this is okay, demonstrate and learn that this is okay to be vulnerable. Yeah, and obviously there are places I have to be vulnerable and to recognize that even the fact that when you are asked, are you okay, to take the courage to say, I'm not okay. Because the expectation, the social norm is to say, I'm okay, even if I'm not, right? So this is also something that Ukrainians are going through, and I am as one of them.
Thank you for the full answers, both of you. There's always more to say, and we'll carry on the conversation. But for today, it's been a lot. I just want to end with two things. In a moment, I'd like to ask everyone to turn their mics off, but not just yet. First of all, I want to remind you today was partly about hearing from some great speakers, keeping the Ukraine flame alive in our minds and in the minds of our networks, our families, our friends, our colleagues, so that indirectly we just keep the salience and the importance of the issue in people's hearts and minds. There was also a fundraising aspect, and that was partly about the people who bought tickets, who had a chance to give more when they did so. We have raised some money through that. If any of you want to give more, there are ways of doing that. And again, you can find that through the website or contact Ivo or myself. So on behalf of Perspectiva and Emerge, I want to thank all of our speakers. I've already thanked Ivo, who helped to arrange it. I want now just all of us, just because it's been a long and quite emotional day, especially towards the end, we'll just have a brief moment of silence together. We can all turn on our mics, so the possibility of sound is there. Just as a way of being slightly closer together, you're welcome to put your mic on, but keep as silent as you can. If you can, Ivo, is there a reason people can't do that? You can, okay, good. Helen and Aftab, and then thank you, we're beginning to do it. Maria, Duncan, Kate has done it, Alexander, Lynn, Joe, Vitas, if you're there. Okay, well, we're giving everyone a chance. Eric's not there, Michael, okay, at least half of you have done it. Just a moment to be silent together, to bear witness to the moment that we're here trying to help each other. And long may it continue. And we wish Ukraine and Ukrainians all the best in every sense. And we'll carry on the conversation and see you again before long. So with that, I know it's 10 o'clock past in Ukraine now, and different times around the world. But thanks everyone for joining wherever you are, and we will see you next time. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Спасибо большое.
Bye.
So much.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Bye.
sticking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You well.
Have a nice weekend. Bye.
You well.